Welcome to another episode of My Mormon Memory. This is JP talking here. The last episode was a very heavy episode. If you haven't listened to it yet, this is the first one you listen to. Go back and start from the very beginning, episode 1, and just go on. The last episode was brutal. I hate talking about that. I've hardly shared that story to anyone, but I hate it. It was a really traumatic experience. I had some punk missionary tell me to shut my kid up in Sacrament, and my kid was only giggling. He wasn't really like throwing a tantrum or anything, and it was just embarrassing, and my wife felt really stupid, and I was really annoyed, and then I had a mental breakdown on my vacation to Oregon, and so go back and listen to that one if you haven't yet. But yeah, I'm not going to say any more about it. Good riddance. It was a really, really traumatic experience in my life. And my wife finds out that I'm doubting the church, and yeah, it was fun. Anyway, so this is the next episode, and this is when we get back from our trip to Oregon, and I'm looking for a job. And at this point, I was really hating church, and I was really doubting, and now I know I'm like 98% convinced the church isn't true, and that Joseph Smith was not what he said he was, and that the church is lying to its members about the truth, that the church is doing everything they can to paint a false narrative to get converts. We get back from our trip to Oregon, and I'm looking for a job, and I think I had a couple of job interviews that it didn't work out, and I was getting really kind of stressed out about how I don't have any job offers and stuff. And it was probably about a month or so since I got laid off from my MOM job that I worked for, and I was going to church every week, and I hated it. I didn't really like the world I was going to. My calling was an elders quorum teacher. I was teaching elders quorum, and I was pretty much reading out of the books that they give out. I don't think they still do them. I don't know. But every year they used to have a former president of the church and their life story, and it was for elders quorum, and that was my calling. Like twice a month I would just teach elders quorum, and it was just always awkward because if you guys are familiar with an elders quorum, it's pretty much the most half-ass govern of human beings that ever existed. I mean, everyone there is just staring at their shoes, and they don't want to be there, and they're just like, is it over yet? But you can't say that, because then you're a bad person. I gotta stock up the chairs now afterwards. It's just no one really wants to be there. And then when you teach elders quorum, everyone kind of just stares at their shoes, and everyone doesn't really, you ask them any question, and they're just like, whoa, and there's just silence, and then the same person just replies every time. And I didn't really like my calling, and then I wasn't doing very good. And one time I taught the same lesson. There was someone who taught a week earlier, and I wasn't there, and then I taught the same lesson. I didn't know, and no one mentioned it until the very end. The elders quorum president's like, you taught the same lesson from last week. I'm like, I didn't know. No one told me when I first started. I opened the book and said, we're on chapter 5, blah, blah, blah. Now, you didn't say, we taught that last week, and I wasn't there last week. I didn't know. And they just let it fly, and then I just looked like a big idiot, and that is so embarrassing. And then another time I was teaching elders quorum, and some guy is like, you need to do a better job at teaching. You need to do this and this and this and this. I don't remember the guy's name, but I'm just like, that made me so mad. I'm like, sit down. Anyway, it was still good though. I didn't hate my calling. I still enjoyed getting up. As an introvert, it was very uncomfortable talking to people, and I can tell no one wanted to be there, and everyone just stared at their shoes the whole time. They weren't even listening. Most of the people were on their phones, probably playing Candy Crush or whatever. I can tell they weren't paying attention. It was just like, why am I doing this if no one's paying attention? There's just a bunch of slackers, this calling's lame. I want a real calling, and I felt like the church, they always called me elders quorum for some reason, elders quorum teacher. Anyway, I wanted to get released from that calling, and I wasn't ready yet because, of course, at the time, my wife didn't want me to doubt the church, and she wanted me to stay active. And so a couple of weeks after our trip, she wanted to go through the temple again. We wanted to go through the American Folk Temple, which was about 10-15 minutes away from where we lived. We wanted to do a date night. It was actually her idea. Do a date night when we go to the temple, and I'm just like, yeah, sure, whatever. And at this point, I'm just like, maybe I'll get an answer this time, but I'm like, no, I don't think so. He didn't give me an answer. God didn't give me an answer last time. It was just a bad answer in the previous episode. I didn't want to go to the temple now. I'm just like, well, I don't want to go to the temple. And I was just like, so we drive there to the American Folk Temple, and we parked the car, and I'm just like, I told my wife, I'm too angry, I don't want to go inside. And she's just like, fine, whatever. And she walked in the temple by herself, and I sat in the car for like an hour and a half, just like really upset. And I'm just like, well, I don't want to go in. I don't believe the church is true anymore. I don't want to go in there. It's creepy. It's just what happened the last time on the last episode, I talked about the last time I was in the temple in Medford, and I'm just like, it's just creepy now. The endowment session, wearing the costumes and stuff is really creepy. And I'm just like, I'm too angry at the church. I don't want to go inside. And that's what I said. And I didn't say that to my wife. All I said to my wife was, I'm kind of angry, and I don't want to be angry inside the temple. And I try to make it seem like that's the main reason why I didn't want to go. I mean, the reason I didn't want to go is because I don't believe in the church anymore, and I had a bad experience the last time, but I didn't want her to know that. I just told her that I was angry. And she's just like, whatever. And she went inside, and then she came back, and she was all sad that I wasn't there. And I'm just like, yeah, I know. Next time I'll go. I'm just really angry, and really stressed, and really stressed out that the church isn't true, and really mad at the church. I was going through a phase when I was really upset with the church, and I was still hating the world I was going to. I was just so tired of church. And like I said, it's like going to a flat earther society meeting. It's just like, I don't believe this anymore. I don't believe any of this. Why am I here? At the same time, I was looking for a job, and I eventually got hired at a job. It was in Sandy, so it was about a 30-minute drive every day, but I was happy that I finally got hired full-time. And this job actually lasted me a long time. I was there for 4.5 years until the pandemic happened, and I'll mention that later in this podcast. But I was at this company, this online marketing company, for a long time, and it helped me get my feet back on the ground. But this job, there's a lot of people who are also ex-Mormon at this job. Pretty much most of the people, like 80% of the people in this job, were people that were either never Mormon or they left the church in the last few years. And I started listening to podcasts while I was working at this job, and because it was like 8 hours a day I was on the computer, so I listened to a bunch of podcasts, and I was listening to a few podcasts, and I started to listen to, I kept seeing stuff about Mormon stories. It was a guy named John DeLynn, and a few years ago I heard about him making the news because he was getting excommunicated by the church because he was revealing too much information. And I'm just like, I kept hearing about this guy on the news, and I'm just like, well, who is this guy? So I looked him up, and I started listening to Mormon stories, and I started learning and uncovering a bunch of stuff, and from other people's experiences, just like mine. I'm just like, I'm not the only person who's doubting the church, and I find out these people seem like decent human beings. I always thought people who doubt the church were evil and bad and angry, and I'm just like, oh no, I might be one of those people. I'm angry now, and I'm just like, I'm becoming evil now because I'm leaving the church. I'm bad. People that leave the church are lazy and bad people. I listen to Mormon stories, and I'm just like, these people seem like completely normal, down-to-earth, good people. And they have the same thing I'm having. I'm just like, a lot of them don't want to leave the church. They love their time in the church, and they just don't believe it anymore, and they decide to leave. And it was all because of historical issues like what I've uncovered. And I'm just like, I'm not crazy. I seriously thought I was crazy. I really thought I was just making things up, like I'm just being deceived. And the only people that leave the church are people who are offended by a bishop or something stupid like that, which isn't the case. Like 99% of the time, that's not the case. And I was really fascinated by Mormon stories. And I listened to another podcast. It was Mormon Expression, I think, was another podcast I listened to. And it was those two podcasts that I was binging through. And there was a lot of episodes, and I was binging the episodes. And at the time, I was more and more convinced that I'm not crazy and that the church isn't true, and that's okay. During this time, I had my shelf collapsed moment. I mentioned in a previous episode that I had a bunch of stuff that I put on the shelf. When I was working for the church, I uncovered a few bad history stuff about the church that was just shelf cracking. You put stuff on the shelf, you put doubts on the shelf, and eventually the shelf is going to collapse. You'll get those answered eventually. The doubts that you have will be answered in due time. You just put them on the shelf and you move on, and you just pay your tithing and go to church and obey and stuff like that. I was putting stuff on the shelf all the time. I was just like this and this and this, polygamy, polyandry, the church is a corporation. A lot of the members aren't Christ-like, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff I was putting on the shelf, and the shelf was starting to collapse, metaphorically. And I was just like, one day, I don't remember what day it was November, I think it was sometime in November of 2015, I was in Sandy, Utah. And it was like one of those things, it's kind of like the JFK assassination or the 9/11. Where were you when you found out that stuff happened? I'm not old enough to remember when JFK was assassinated, but I do remember 9/11, where I was in 9/11. And it was kind of a moment where it's just just like, people always know where they're at when they found out the church wasn't true. And I remember I was in an office in Sandy, Utah, and that's when I found out. It was an afternoon of November of 2015. Before, I had probably about 80% doubts, 90% doubts, but when I found out, oh my gosh, it's made up, I knew exactly where I was, and it was at my work. There was actually two things that made me come to realization and a consensus that the church was made up. Two of them. One of them was an episode of Mormon Expression where they talked about the changes in the temple. I don't know if this is still up. The podcast isn't around. I don't think they make new episodes, but Mormon Expression had an episode where they talk about the top 10 changes in the temple, and I was curious and I clicked on it, and I wasn't really aware of all the changes. I know they tweaked a few things. You don't stand up every time they do the signs anymore. Yeah, there's a change, and then I heard about a few other things, but it wasn't major, But then I listened to this podcast, this episode, and I'm just like, holy shit, there is a whole bunch of stuff I don't even know about. And I learned about the preacher, how there used to be a preacher in the endowment session that used to work with Satan. He was dressed up like a Catholic priest, and he had like a whole big role in the endowment session movie, and they completely took that out back in 1990 or sometime. And I was blown away. I'm just like, I had no idea. And I'm not going to explain all the details of this. You can look it up. But there was that. There was the oath of vengeance. I've never heard of that. That was crazy. And then the one that really blew my mind, it was the final one. It was the number one that they talked about. It was the penalties that were taken away in 1990. And that, when I found out about that, I was like, I am done. Like, the church is not true, because that is most creepy, most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. It was disgusting. The whole process of preempting, slitting your throat, that if you reveal any of this stuff, it's just creepy. That's like a blood coat kind of thing. It's just like, that's what people used to do, and that's probably why my parents never went back to the temple. And all the people that raised me in the church, the bishops, the mission presidents, stake presidents I had my whole life, they did that for years until 1990, and the church just got rid of it because people didn't like it. And I'm just like, it's all made up. That's when I'm just like, why would the church change all this stuff? That was another reason why it bothered me. It wasn't just because it was creepy and weird, barbaric. It's just, why would God restore the temple and then it changes every so often because of political pressure or people are uncomfortable? And I found out about that, and I'm just like, I remember I felt sick. I remember going to the bathroom and I almost threw up. I'm just like, I'm not going to church ever again. Like, not only is the church not true, it's so messed up. It's way darker than. And then I remembered it all came to my head. I'm just like, it makes sense. The hand in cup in shape, the signs, the thumb extended, that's the blade, and the cup in shape is what catches the blood. There's still signs of the penalties in the endowment session. It's still there. There are still remnants of it in there, and it all made sense. It all made sense to me. It was all originally about the penalties, and it made me sick to my stomach. I was just like, I don't want to go to the temple ever again, and I haven't. I've never been back to the temple since, and I want to stop going to church, and I need to tell my wife I don't want to go to church anymore. But I was still worried about that, and I was sick to my stomach. I'm like, holy shit, the church is not true. But then a couple of days later, I found out about a few other things about church history in the Book of Mormon, and I learned about, I mentioned in the first couple of episodes, I discovered the View of the Hebrews back in 2012. This was years before, about how there's another book that's just like the Book of Mormon during Joseph Smith's time, before the Book of Mormon, and I'm just like, that's odd. But then I'm like, not a big deal. But it bothered me. I put it on my shelf, and then I found out there was other books that are similar. There's a book called The First Book of Napoleon. It's a book that came out before Joseph Smith's time, and it was all in the schools in the New England area during the time when Joseph Smith lived there. And it was pretty much, if you read The First Book of Napoleon, you can probably Google search it, you find a PDF online, you read it, it sounds exactly like the Book of Mormon. It says stuff like, and it came to pass that in these latter days that there was a great contention among the land, yea, and like that sounds like that's exactly how the whole book begins. And I'm just like, oh my God, this is just like the Book of Mormon. But even then, I'm just like, well, that's probably just how people talk back then. That's not how they talk back then. But I was just like, whatever. I was still kind of like defending myself, like, oh, church might be still true. And then I got to chapter 2. Somewhere in chapter 2, I got to the part, and this is when my shelf finally collapsed completely. And the very first verses or paragraphs of chapter 2 of this book says something like this. And it came to pass that I, Napoleon, being a man small in stature, and I'm just like, wait a minute. Wait a darn minute. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? The Book of Mormon says, I, Nephi, being a man large in stature. And this book says, I, Napoleon, being a man small in stature. And I'm just like, wait, you're telling me that Joseph Smith read this book, and of course he created the Nephi characters, being the man large in stature. He switched it around. Napoleon's a man small in stature. Nephi's a man large in stature. I'm like, Joseph Smith, you tricky bastard. It was like a light bulb. Like, ding, he made it up. The whole thing he made the whole thing up. The whole thing is made up, and it actually made me feel good. I'm just like, it makes sense now that the church doesn't make sense. It's not true. It's all made up. Joseph Smith made it all up. He based a lot of the verbiage and the sound of the Book of Mormon from the first book of Napoleon, and then there was another book called The Great War between Great Britain and the United States or whatever, and that's all the war stories, and it makes sense that the Book of Mormon doesn't make sense. There was a bunch of stuff in the Book of Mormon where I'm just like, that cannot happen. There's no way that two major civilizations of just swords, and then there's no still swords back then, mind you, they just somehow wipe each other out. That's never happened in human history. The only way to wipe out an entire civilization is either by disease or nuclear bomb. But like they wiped each other out by attacking each other. It's like, were the kids attacking each other too? Like, it just doesn't, that stuff never made sense either. But this is when it's just like, oh, it's made up. When I read that Napoleon was a man small in stature, and Joseph Smith was like, oh, I can use that in this book, but I'm going to have it the opposite because Nephi is a big guy. Anyway, that was when I found out the church was 100% not true. That was it. I'm just like, it's all made up. And that was when my shelf officially collapsed. And at this point, I'm just like, I am done. I don't want to go to church anymore. I want to get released from my calling. And that would be the next episode. The next episode, I want to talk about the awkward and the creepy interview that I had with my bishop in my ward about why I'm down in the church, and that should be the next episode because it's a lot to talk about. It's really crazy. And so at this time I was learning more and more stuff about church history and how it was just, I learned about Mark Hoffman. I never really heard about that guy before, how he single-handedly fooled the general authorities by forging documents like the Salamander letter and all this other stuff. He tricked the general authorities, and it was Hinckley, it was Kimball, it was all these guys, Oakes, all these high up general authorities in the church were fooled by this guy, and they bought all of his forged documents to hide them. And they even mentioned it in general conference once. Hinckley talked about it in a general conference talk years ago. I looked it up, and he talked about the blessing that Joseph Smith gave to his son regarding who should lead the church, and he mentioned that in the talk, and that was all made up. And then the guy ends up blowing up and killing two people later on. And the church did not, they tell me that the leaders of the church, the prophets, seers, and revelators, didn't even know that this guy was fooling them and eventually would murder two people. I heard about that too a few weeks after. And I'm just like, it just keeps getting worse and worse. I find out more and more stuff that the church is total shit. Like, it was crazy. I'm just like, how could I be deceived? It was absolutely insane. I'm like, how could I be so stupid? And then I felt extremely guilty about all the people I talked to in my mission and converted, and how I might have come across a self-righteous jerk all these years, and how I was so judgmental of people who drunk alcohol and smoked and who weren't LDS, and I was so judgmental of those people, and I would defend the church online, and attack anti-Mormons online and calling them haters and bigots, and really I was the hater and bigot, and I was so embarrassed and shamed by that. And I started learning that there was so many good people outside of the church, so many people that left the church. And I had a brother-in-law, my wife's sister's husband, who he was in the bishopric. He was a high councilman. He was high up, and he had like really major surgery, and he almost died back in 2012, so several years before this. And after this whole incident, he started studying the church, and he eventually left the church. And it was the biggest shock ever. I'm just like, how could this guy leave the church? He is like the coolest guy ever, the nicest guy ever. He was so high up in the church. He was going to the temple like all the time, like once a week. And this guy was like true blue. And he completely goes atheist. Like, not only he leaves religion completely. He's like completely atheist now. And I'm like, what the crap? It was the most random thing. But then wanted to talk to him about it, but I was too scared to talk to my wife about it. But I eventually reached out to him through email, and he's just like, oh, wow. Okay. And then we had a talk about it and stuff like that. And it was pretty much the same thing that I had. I was thinking, oh, maybe he just wants to sin, and he never had a testimony to begin with, but he did. He always had a testimony, and he served a mission, and he just found out the church wasn't true by its history, how stuff like that, and that was the exact same thing. So another reason I'm like, I'm not crazy. There's most of the people who leave the church are people like me. There are people who found out the history wasn't true, that the church lied to them, and there's more to the story, and they don't want us to know the truth. They don't want us to know the true history, because they don't want us to know about the rock in the hat and all this stuff and all this crazy stuff, and I was just like, I'm done. I don't want to go to church anymore. I want to talk to my wife, and I want to talk to my bishop, and I want to get released from my calling. And this is when I'm just like, I'm done. I guess I'm throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I guess is what I could call it. Just throwing it all out, just like, I'm done. So anyway, the next episode is when I talk to my wife for the first real talk that I've had to my wife about leaving the church, and then I'm talking to my bishop. So don't miss that episode. It's a big one. Anyway, thanks for listening to this episode. This has been My Mormon Memory. Thanks for listening, and have a good day. Bye.